Hi there, I'm just going to talk to you about John Donne's poem, The Flea. Just to start with, it's worth knowing a tiny bit of context about John Donne, who is often referred to as a metaphysical poet. And really, in simple terms, this just means that he has a tendency to explore quite spiritual ideas, i.e. beyond the physical, but often through very physical and tangible topics. And so in this poem, we have the particular device of the conceit, which is an extended image which often seems very unlikely and distant to start with, where one thing represents another. And in the case of the flea, it is the idea that the flea represents sexual consummation. So two things that you would not normally associate given an analogy. And we have to think about those reactions to that title because it's something that might symbolize annoyance, irritation, perhaps disgust. But it is worth remembering that in the century this is written, it would be far more common and likely for fleas. It wouldn't quite be as ridiculous or as upsetting an idea maybe as it is in 2018. So if we look at the first stanza, you see this conceit introduced, and he is essentially inviting us to look at a flea and mark in this how little that which thou deniest me is. So firstly, it's the size of the flea, this tiny, insignificant thing, which represents what the listener, a lover, is denying him, sexual satisfaction. So he is implying that the sexual consummation is a tiny, unimportant thing, just like a flea, but then it moves to an idea of mixing of fluids. So fundamentally, the flea sucks blood from its victim, and so in sucking both their bloods are mingled. And so really, the flea then becomes an image of mixed bodily fluids, i.e. the sexual act. And by saying that sharing of fluids through the flea is not a shame, not a loss, then the actual sexual act is just as insignificant. So he introduces this kind of comic comparison between the flea and sexuality, which then indicates this relationship. So especially given the topic of a flea biting them, there is a suggestion of a setting. Perhaps these two lovers are in bed or somewhere quite private, and he is in the process of trying to woo or seduce this lover. The argument is then developed through the structure of the stanzas. So we have this use of three stanzas so that there is a kind of progression to the conceit or the argument. And stanza 2 really is where it is developed and made much more complex, because he suggests that in sparing the flea, 3 lives are spared, the fleas and the 2 lovers whose blood it's drank. And you see throughout there is this kind of embedding of very religious lexis. The bed is turned into a temple. The use of the words sin and shame in the first stanza. And so the flea becomes a very helpful argument because religion perhaps is the biggest obstacle between the male speaker and his lover. And so the flea is then used as a sort of weapon to dismiss the religious arguments for virginity or preserving sex outside of marriage. This then progresses into the third stanza, which is very much a conclusion. There is obviously an event between stanzas 2 and 3. It's assumed that the silent listener has killed the flea, which leads to this more dramatic, violent language. And really that event simply proves the argument because the death of the flea has not made any difference, and so their sexual mingling would also make very little difference to their identity. It's really the sort of absurdity and incongruity of the image that allows it to work. It somehow makes the sexual nature of the poem much more innocent and playful. It allows a kind of initial disguising of the sexual undertones, and it's our sort of surprise at the logic of the analogy that makes it more persuasive and convincing. So it's up to you to decide how successful you think John Donne is in seducing his lover, but the use of a very ridiculous image of the flea means that we gradually come to accept this argument and agree that this flea's death took very little life from them, just as having sex would take very little from their soul or their innocence.